All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for those of you that were brave enough to come a little closer. I appreciate it because I thought everybody was going to be sitting back there and I didn't know how I was going to get through this next 2 hours. This is a micro workshop because this is literally a workshop that I normally do in a full day. So kind of full disclosure, be prepared for that. Some pieces we will go maybe a little quicker than I would normally like to. I like to really dig into a lot of process pieces. This is called Inclusive Design, the Product and the Process, and we'll unpack what that means throughout the morning. I'm Derek Featherstone. I'm the Chief Experience Officer at a company called Level Access. I've been doing this kind of work for basically 20 years now, and this is what I do. I love this. I actually used to teach high school, and I used to teach a little bit at the college level as well, so this is now like really kind of taking me back. This is a little bit bizarre, but I'm good with it. I'm Feather on Twitter, Derek.Featherstone at levelaccess.com. If you want to connect with me, email, whatever. I'm all about that. Feather on Twitter if you want to connect there as well. If you're active there, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on all of the places. So I'd be happy to connect with you there and discuss a little more. We're going to go right into this. This is a tweet from about May of 2016, and you can see the photo in the tweet is these 6 oranges that are stacked up, and they're in these clear plastic containers, and they are all pre-peeled. And the tweet that goes with it says, if only nature would find a way to cover these oranges so we didn't need to waste so much plastic on them. And of course, you know, this was a thing at the time that I captured this like a year and a half later. It had 70,000 retweets and 70,000 likes, and now it's like 150,000 likes and 150,000 retweets. It just kind of keeps going, and it makes the rounds. Whole Foods was actually raked over the coals a little bit for this because of this waste of plastic, and of course much discussion ensued because basically it was the internet and somebody was wrong. So all of these people kind of jumped in and started talking about the environmental impact and lots of other impacts as well. And then a few voices came out in the conversation where someone actually said, hey, I've got really, really bad arthritis. This is like super awesome for me because I can't peel an orange. And now, because I can get this orange in a container, yes, it uses plastic, but I reuse those containers, and this is actually really good for me. And somebody else said, hey, I had a stroke, 7 years ago, and I can't use my left hand anymore, so I can't really peel an orange with just one hand. People are like, whoa, this is this new interesting thing. People weren't really expecting that, and so much much discussion happens back and forth, and ultimately one person jumps in, and she is actually one of the original people that was commenting on this, and she has a disability herself. And she said, look, this is really fantastic, but that accessibility was not the reason behind why they did this, right? Accessibility is nice and all, but that wasn't the thinking behind this. It wasn't designed to be accessible, right? And this is what I consider to be a thing. It's accidentally accessible, right? It happened, but it's not likely super repeatable. It was unintentional. It just kind of happened. We still achieved this accessibility outcome, right? It's an accessible thing, but it wasn't done intentionally. And so one of the things that I would love for you to kind of take away from this is knowing and understanding that accessibility happens by accident all the time in our work, every single day, right? We don't like to admit it, but it's true, right? Accessibility is a thing that often happens by accident. We want to be really intentional with this, right? That is part of our job. And so one of the reasons that I like inclusive design as a practice is that it helps make this intentional. This is a thing where we are saying as designers, and even if we're not designers, practicing inclusive design is an intentional way of achieving accessibility as an outcome. So people ask me all the time, what's the difference between accessibility and inclusive design? And the most simplest terms that I could possibly put on it is this: accessibility is an outcome. That is the thing that we are measuring. That is the thing that we are trying to see. How well did we achieve this? But inclusive design is a process. Inclusive design is a process. It's a methodology that we use to help us achieve that accessibility, that accessible outcome. So I hope that makes sense. Now, when we talk about how these things relate, there's a lot of different terminology that we'll hear. So I consider this accessibility is the ability to be accessed or readily used by people with disabilities, right? Accessibility has a lot of different meanings. I like this because it keeps it really straightforward and simple. Can you use it, right? If you have a disability, can you use it? So that's accessibility to me. The inclusive, and I tend to be, so I'm a digital guy, so I think of inclusive experience design or user experience design, although I've done lots of work with teams in like inclusive service design, right? Or inclusive something design, right? We can apply these same concepts over and over and over again. But as kind of a digital person with a background in the web design area and kind of the UX side of things, I tend to gravitate towards that. So inclusive user experience design would be this intentional facilitation and crafting of interactions. This is a mouthful, really. The intentional facilitation and crafting of interactions within an ecosystem that incorporate inclusion as a core value. Now, to me, the most important, I ask this all the time, and if we were doing this for the full day version, I would get you all to kind of say, like, which words resonate with you the most, and we would all kind of share, and then with 100 of you in here, that would take us up until at least lunch. So that would be awesome. But really, I want you to think about that. What is the word in there that resonates the most with you? Some people gravitate towards the idea of intentional, right? Because it's all about that intent. As a designer, as a professional, that intent is one of the most important things that we can express. Other people love the word craft in there because they understand that this is not a science. It's not pure art, but it's kind of like taking those two things together to create this craft of this practice that we have. I used to be, as I said, I used to be a high school teacher. I was a biology teacher, biology, chemistry, and computers, which is kind of how I gravitated into this area. But the biologist in me is always like this ecosystem. Of course, I'm going to work the word ecosystem in there because it shares kind of this concept that there's a lot of interconnected things that all make up kind of what an experience might be. But I think the most important piece in this, I don't know why I'm getting goosebumps, but I think I love talking about this piece. The idea of inclusion being a core value is to me the most important piece, because even if none of the other words that we use, these other buzzwords or whatever they are, they're some great words, but even if we didn't use them, if we maintain that inclusion is a core value, that means we don't let inclusion be deprioritized. We don't allow things to be deprioritized and put in a backlog for 7 years, right? If we say that inclusion is a core value, we then get to hold our organizations accountable to that. Almost every organization that we work with today has some kind of a diversity, equity, and equality and inclusion practice, right? They say that we believe in this thing. And so when our organizations say that, we get to hold them accountable and say, inclusion is a core value. Here's what that means to us. We don't allow this to be deprioritized. If it's a core value, guess what that means? It gets budget. It gets people. It gets resources. It gets training and learning and all of these other things that go with things that an organization, whether it's a corporation or an institution of higher education, a nonprofit, whatever it is, if we say it's a core value, or if an organization makes that claim, they get to say or put their money where their mouth is and say, this is how we live that out. So lots of different definitions. And I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I wanted to use that to kind of frame things. I'll give you an example. This is a house. You can see here, it's like a duplex. And this is in Norwich, I think, or somewhere in north of England. And you can see on the left-hand house here, the left side of the house, there are some stairs going up. And interestingly enough, they call it council housing over in the UK, and that means it's like subsidized housing for lower income families. And a woman lives here with her daughter. and that daughter happens to be on a motorized scooter. And as you can see from the several stairs going up the left-hand side, this is not an accessible house for her. So they decide, the town council decides, okay, we need to make sure that we have accessible housing for this family. And so they decide they're going to install a ramp. And the ramp ends up being, you can see here, they've got like, I would say in their front yard, they have probably, 60 or 70 feet from the house to the street level. They took up all of that with a ramp in order to provide an accessible entrance to the house. It's an eyesore. It's a thing that most people in the neighborhood don't like, except for the local kids that ride skateboards. They love it. I think it's the best thing ever. It literally takes up the entire front yard. This is, and if you look at it, this is just looking down from the house down to the street. You can see it literally takes up the entire front yard. Now it's made of this steel. We've got these steel railings around, and we've got this a steel flat surface for the ramp itself. It's got all kinds of holes in it that let the water just fall through when it rains. It has about 6 switchbacks, so it's got all the required slope that a wheelchair or mobility device needs. It's got the exact right slope. It's got the right amount of clearance for corners. It's got the right turning radius. It meets every single technical requirement, right? This is accessibility, right? They have provided an accessible entrance, but it's accessibility as an afterthought. It's accessibility that's by the book. It meets all the technical requirements, but it doesn't really do much for the neighborhood, and it doesn't really do much for the family other than make this young lady have a really long path to get to her front door. And this is also a case where it's kind of accessibility at the expense of everything else, where it was the only requirement. In many cases, in the world in which we live, accessibility is not the only requirement. It's one requirement out of many competing requirements, or they're often competing. So this is a case where we've achieved that outcome of accessibility, but it wasn't necessarily overall a good outcome, right? We might have actually found that something else might have been a better solution. Perhaps, doing something with the stairs and putting in, doing some excavation and putting in an elevator, or some other mechanism could have been used to create an accessible entrance. This whole project apparently cost about $40,000 in order to do this. And I do believe I saw this in a newspaper article online. They actually said that it was very likely that it probably only would have cost about $20,000 to pack up the family and move them to a more modern, newer council house where all the entrances were at street level. So we have to really rethink the way that we're looking at accessibility, right? We achieve that outcome, but is this, what's the method that we actually use to get there? I'm a big believer that in today's day and age, we used to talk about we achieved accessibility. We got there by accident, or we built this website and it wasn't accessible, and then we found out and we went back and we fixed it, right? Or we achieve accessibility often in higher ed. We achieve accessibility using a term called accommodation, right? It's like we can't make this thing accessible. It's too hard to make accessible, so we're going to find some other way, right? There's some themes that will carry through for the rest of the morning here. But I'm a big believer that in today's day and age, the mechanism that we use to achieve accessibility actually matters, right? The mechanism that we use to achieve accessibility matters. If you compare that ramp with this sign, this is a sign from the Canadian National Institute for the Blind in Toronto. They had a new facility built I think in the mid 2000s. And we went on a tour there, and this sign has some, and they know their constituents very well. This sign is like a typical wall placard beside the rooms, and there are some really obvious features of this sign that help us understand that it's for people that are blind or have low vision or maybe are deafblind. And so if you look here, there's some obvious features. This sign is about probably about 8 to 10 inches tall and about 8 to 10 inches wide, just so you can visualize how big that is. I know up there on the screen, that's like 175 inches tall, but that's not to scale, right? This is objects on the display are much larger than they actually appear in real life. So think of that sign as about like an 8-inch by 8-inch wall placard. And there's a few interesting things. So they have really high contrast lettering, large high contrast lettering, 108 deafblind literacy, right? Super high contrast. One thing you can't really see well in the photo is that all of those letters are recessed. They're not like pressed on or sublimated in just a flat sign. All the letters are recessed and kind of carved out of that material so that somebody could just trace the letter forms with their finger, right? One way that people will read. The other thing that you might notice down below is there's another 108 deafblind literacy in raised all caps lettering down below the main part of the sign. And then there's also Braille underneath that as well. And all of those things are really wonderful features for people with different disabilities. The thing that I love the most about it, and I don't know how well it comes out up there, but that where the raised lettering, the Braille is, do you see how it's on a little bit of an angle? That piece is sticking out on about a 45-degree angle on a piece of the sign that sticks out. And I asked them about that. I said, this is fascinating. Tell me more about this. How did you figure this out, that this was something you wanted to do on the signs? And they said it was really, really simple. We watched people at our old building, and we would watch many people that were blind or had low vision. They would be walking along down the hallway, and they would be feeling along the wall. So they would just be walking along with their hand on the wall, feeling for the signs. And then when they got to the sign, they felt the sign. In order to read it, because the signs were flat, they had to drop their shoulder and bend their wrist back to be able to get their fingertips to get a good, to touch the surface of the lettering or the Braille. And they're like, so instead of making them drop their shoulder and bend their wrist backwards, we just made it so that it was on this piece of sign that stuck out, so it was a much more natural reading angle. I'm like, brilliant. That's what I want us to do with websites and web apps, right? We want to actually think about the mechanism that we use there, that we actually include people with disabilities in the process in order to achieve the right solution, right? This is an example of people thinking about making this thing not just accessible, but really easy to use for people with disabilities, and understanding the kind of the milieu in which people live and how they use things. We don't find that out if we go by a spec. Right? We find this out from working with people. And that's kind of our charge as designers, as professionals, is to include people with disabilities in this process. So before I go any further, I want to acknowledge a few things. This is my statement, because there's a lot of different lenses of what inclusion means today. And in many cases, when we start talking about inclusive design, we're already seeing that people with disabilities are now being left out of that discussion as well, even though inclusive design was a thing that kind of came about in the 70s and 80s, 1970s, 1980s, from people with disabilities being excluded from things. And when we talk about inclusive design, you've probably heard this and felt this as well. When we talk about inclusive design today, we tend to talk about gender and gender identity. We talk about race, ethnic origin. We talk about age. We talk about all different kinds of inclusion and what it means to be inclusive, right? And for some reason, people with disabilities are kind of being left out of that conversation again. If you go and look on many organizations, and this happens at companies, it happens in government, it happens everywhere. If you go and look at what people say they believe in terms of diversity, equality, and inclusion, you will not find a lot of statements about people with disability. They'll talk about everybody, and they will bring up issues like gender and gender identity, and they will bring up issues of ethnicity and nationality and other things. And they will bring up, if we're lucky, they will bring up issues of age. Well, they don't often bring up the issue of disability. So I'm kind of throwing this out there, I 100% acknowledge that there are many, many different lenses to inclusion, but the one that I speak from, the one that I experience the most, is the work that I've been doing for the last 20 years, which is understanding inclusion from the lens of accessibility for people with disabilities. That's where I come from. I can speak from a place of knowing with that, and I can try to transfer some of those things to other areas. But hey, like I'm a 40-something-year-old white dude that is Canadian, and I'm talking about inclusion and diversity. Like, yes, I am, and I'm going to use that platform because sometimes the fact that I'm a 47-year-old white dude actually helps get that message across to other 47-year-old white dudes who don't listen to other people. So I'm going to use that as much as I can, and I acknowledge it. I know that my lens is not the same lens that you all have, and that's how it is, right? That's how it works. I also don't have any disabilities that have resulted in any discrimination or exclusion, and I say at least not yet. I do have a disability. You can't see it right now, but I'll let you see in a minute. That sounds weird. It's not, I promise. I'm also 100% willing to acknowledge, like, I've been doing this for 20 years, and one of the reasons that I love accessibility and inclusion is that I am learning new stuff all the time. Like, straight up, I know a lot, but there's so much more that I don't know, and I'm actively kind of like, what don't I know? What do I need to work on next? So my disability, this is a photo of me and my dad. My dad is the one with the sideburns. You can see that I was born in the 1970s. You can tell by the really horrid turquoise and peach kitchen, and that lamp that's in the background. I don't even know what that is, but that's some kind of lamp. If you take a look at my left foot, you will actually see that my left foot doesn't look the way that a left foot normally looks. I was born with a club foot, which means that my leg was straight-ish, but my toes were kind of pointing off to the right-hand side of me. And so my something happened. Don't really know why. They call it, I don't even like the name, but they call it Thales malformis, which is like so negative and judgy. Like, just, I don't care if it's Latin. It's like very judgy. But so I had operations and casts for about the first 3 years of my life. I was in a cast, and what they do is the treatment for this is literally like and it's pure medical model of disability, not social model of disability. It's like, your foot's wrong, your toes are supposed to point straight forward, so we're going to make your toes point straight forward. And so they took my foot and they turned it out. I had to wear shoes that basically my feet pointed out at 45-degray angles, and there was a bar in between them, and it was like, so that I couldn't like turn my foot in. They're like, yeah, we got to fix this guy. I had an operation, and they cut like a bunch of, they cut tendons on the bottom of your foot, and they use that kind of the healing nature to stretch it out so that the tendons are all really short on the bottom of my foot, and so they cut them so that they heal, but they heal a little bit longer, right? And so I still have some issues, but I haven't been excluded or discriminated against yet. But there might be a time, I can feel it coming as I'm getting older, that I will probably at some point need accessible parking, right? As I'm getting older, I don't have the flexibility in my ankle anymore. Everything tightens up. I then feel that in my ankle, which transfers to my knee, then to my hip, and to my shoulders and my back, which means, I can stand for a while, but I can't stand for 8 hours anymore. I can't sit and work in a chair for 8 hours anymore. I have to kind of vary it up, right? So I can see a future where that kind of changes. That's my disability, and people are like, that's you're right. We can't see that. Many people with disabilities, you can't visually tell, right? Like I'm looking out in here, and there's say 100 of us in here. There's a good chance that somewhere between 15 and 20 of us have a disability, but we can't tell, right? There's people with disabilities in this room. That's it. Between the ages of 70 and 79 is when it becomes a coin toss. 50% chance that somewhere between by the time we're all between 70 and 79, it's going to be a coin toss as to whether or not we ourselves have a disability. So it's everywhere. It's all around us. So we're talking about accessibility. We're talking about inclusion. I want to dig into this. There's kind of two levels of inclusion that I think of. And one thing I'm seeing here, and I love it, like I see people taking notes. Take notes 100%, as much as you want. You can write down every single word that I say, and that will totally feed my ego, and that's all awesome and everything. But you will all get a copy of these slides, and I don't know if that's part of the conference plan, but if you want to write things down, go for it. But don't feel that you have to write everything down, because you're never going to see these slides again. We'll make sure that you get a copy of these slides. So 2 levels of inclusion. There's inclusion in the product and inclusion in the process. So when we think of creating an inclusive product, we're ultimately we are creating a product or a thing that does not exclude people with disabilities, right? If we think of the process, inclusive design, we're looking at creating a process that does not exclude people with disabilities. So for me, inclusive design, and many people think of inclusive design in 2 different ways. They will think of inclusive design as, inclusive design as a noun, or design as a noun, right? So if you think of design as a noun, we created that inclusive design. Totally fine. Inclusive is the adjective. This is like grade whatever grammar, right? Inclusive is the adjective, design is the noun. We also go back to inclusive design if we're thinking about it as the process, design as an action, as a verb. Inclusive is now an adverb, right? So we're going to focus on 2 sides of it. Inclusive design, the product, for the first part, and then the second part we will go into inclusive design, the process. Both are important to make this work. Right? If we create an inclusive product, but we didn't involve people with disabilities in it, we aren't practicing inclusive design. We can create and we can practice inclusive design and also not necessarily achieve creating an inclusive product. And that's okay. We need to get better. We continue to get better. So this is a tap at a hotel in London. We're going to dig into the product side here and learn about creating more inclusive products. This is a tap at a hotel in London that I stayed at when I was there for a conference, and I have a hot water tap on the left and I have a hot water tap on the right, and I don't know what to do. Like, I'm out, right? I'm not showering today. This is just not doing this. This interface doesn't make sense until I see a sign that tells me the left tap operates the shower and the right tap operates the bath. Right? So now I at least know if I'm going to burn my head or my feet, right? The problem with this is that the tap is exactly where you expect it to be, and the instructions that tell you how to operate it are about 6 feet away on the side wall of the bathtub or of the shower enclosure. Almost every person that is not a designer that I show this to, they intuitively know, like, that's just wrong. Those instructions need to be near the tap, right? And then in design terms, we call that proximity, right? These 2 things that are related to one another need to be together. So we're going to turn that into a digital thing here. How's the lighting on the screen? It's bad. Well, that's not good. I've been looking at my stuff the whole time. I'm like, this looks fantastic. Can we adjust the lights a little to bring the front lights down?
Let me see.
It's super important for this next piece.
Yeah.
Oh, well, okay. Hang on. We're going to start over. I'm going back to the booth now. So we're going to look at this issue of proximity, and we're going to apply it to a digital interface now. All right. So one of the things that we're going to do, and I need some crowd participation here. So be prepared for this. You didn't necessarily know I was going to make you do this, but this is fun for me anyway. So I'd love for you, if you're able to see the screen, what I'd love for you to do, I'm going to display an interface here, and we're going to do a very quick simulation. I'm going to give you some caveats about that simulation in a second. So the very first thing I'd love for you to do is take your left or your right hand, if you're able to, and hold it up in the air. And then I want you to make a fist, a loose fist, like you're holding on to a straw, okay? So you're holding on to a straw. Now what I would love for you to do is to take that and put it, you're all doing perfectly well so far. This is excellent. You're going to take it and hold it up to your eye, and you're going to close the other eye or cover it, and you're going to look at the screen through the straw, okay? Now, don't make this like a big, like you're holding on to a garden hose or like a big milkshake straw. Think of like a little tiny straw that you get as a coffee stir stick kind of thing. So tiny straw. Okay, you can put your straws down for a second. I haven't, the thing is not up there yet. So we are going to do a very quick simulation. And this simulation definitely comes from a place of knowing. This is, what we're doing by looking through the straws, we are artificially limiting the field of view that we have of the screen, right? Now, the caveat that I said I was going to give you, this does not replace working with people that actually have low vision, right? We can't just do this simulation and call it a day and we're done, right? We have to actually work with people with low vision. But what this does is this gives us a chance to understand a little bit about what it might be like to have some of the effects of low vision. This does nothing to teach us anything about what it's really like to have low vision, right? So we are artificially limiting the field of view, which is a good design step to take, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. So what we're going to do, I'm going to reveal the interface, and you will go through this, and you will fill out this form. So it's a form. For those of you that are way at the back, you're probably regretting it now. You're like, oh, we should have sat way closer than this. So ready to go, straws up. And make sure that you're covering or close the other eye, because if you don't, you're kind of cheating, right? So straws up, ready to go. Here's the interface. You go through and fill out that form. And while you do that, I will take a photo of you. No, I'm kidding. I won't do that. Now, even though this is a simulation, there's a lot of reality in this, right? You all finished at different times, right? We're all going to get through this task at different times. We're all going to have different degrees of success. We're all going to react to this differently. Some of you are like, yeah, no problem. Some of you are like, whoa, that's horrible, right? This form was an interface that was coded to perfection. It met every technical requirement of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The forms were all labeled. It was all understandable as to which, when we were dealing with the yes-no radio buttons, there was a good association with the questions. This was coded perfectly. It worked perfectly well. We were doing some testing with people with disabilities. Worked perfectly well for someone that was using a screen reader. Worked perfectly well for somebody that was using Dragon Naturally Speaking. Did not work well at all for people that had low vision. Here's why. Remember we said we were looking through the straw. We were artificially limiting the field of view there. Now some people with low vision physically have a limited field of view because they maybe don't have peripheral vision. They only have central vision, right? So some of their vision might be blocked. So there's like the physical aspect of it, of their vision. Some people have just lower visual acuity. There's again, I'm talking about these things like there's only two reasons that people have a limited field of view. It's 100% not that, right? But think of it as like there's some physical reason that we only have a limited field of view. For some people, their visual acuity is such that they need to magnify the screen. And so they may magnify the screen and only have a limited field of view because of that. This is magnified at about 300% now. At 300%, you see 1/9 of the screen at a time. At 200%, we see 1/4 of the screen at a time. At 500%, you would see, I'm totally being a teacher here. You didn't know there's going to be math. You see 1/25 of the screen at a time if you're at 500% magnification. right? There's math behind that. We're not gonna force that on you. In some recent usability testing, we had two people, I think it was two people, it might even be more, that were magnifying their screen at 1200%, which means they were seeing 1/144th of the screen at any given time. That is a tiny, tiny piece of the screen. So think of the effects of this and like amplify that even more. So this form, if you took a look here, when you were looking at the question and you read over and you slid over to this, there's like these two columns, right? We had a column that had questions in it and a column that had answers where you would fill out the form. And when we move over and pan over to the point where we get to those questions, one of the things that happens is we lose that visual association with the question, right? That gap of white space seems like it's not that big of a deal when we're looking at this form as a whole. But if we have that limited field of view, we're in a situation where the question and the answer are separated by this chasm of white space. It's basically the same thing as the tap and the instructions being 6 feet away from each other, right? That's exactly what that is. This is a proximity issue. This ends up being a poor design for somebody that has low vision. Now, I watched you as you were doing that, as you were moving and panning around the screen. I totally gave it away. What motion were you going through as you were filling out the form? We're going like back and forth, and we're moving down the page, right? So we're on the left and we move to the right. We're on the left, we move to the right, we move back to the left, back to the right, back to the left, back to the right. And because of this left, right, left, right, left, right pattern of use, our next move was to go to the left, where we have exactly our least favorite call to action, the quit button. Right? When you were panning around, did you find that you started to establish a bit of muscle memory? Like you knew how far to pan over to get to that right-hand column? That happens in real life with people with low vision, right? There's like a muscle memory. This is where I need to get to, so I'm going to move over that far. And with that muscle memory, and I move over to that column, I end up on my second least favorable call to action, the previous button. When you take all of that and then look at those three buttons, in design terms, we say that they have the same visual weight. They're roughly the same shape. They're the same shape. They're almost all the identical size, and they're all the same color. That's what defines its visual weight. The only way to tell the difference between these buttons is by looking at the text that's there. And that might be difficult for many different people. So they have the same visual weight. So we've got the chunking all wrong, the proximity is all wrong, the pattern of use is all wrong, and the visual weight all this is like a conspiracy of design against people with low vision right now, even though it worked perfectly for someone that was using a screen reader. Now, I mention this for a reason. One of the most important things, and we see this all the time with people that are clients, people that aren't clients, we very, very much think accessibility, we think screen reader right away, right? And that's pretty common. That's pretty natural, I think. But we do need to think beyond just screen reader, screen reader, screen reader. We need to, and this is why inclusive design is wonderful and a good thing. When we practice inclusive design, we are constantly asking ourselves, who are we excluding right now? And what do we do to change that? Who can we bring in? How do we include more people in this conversation so that we know that we're taking into account more people's needs? That's one of the beauties of inclusive design. We're able to take this interface, we can completely transform it into something like this. Very straightforward. We're now in a position where we've converted that into a single vertical stack. Almost every single one of you should recognize that now as something that also works really well on this mobile device, right? And if you take a look at that screen, this is completely not a fair A/B type test, but go ahead and fill this one out now with the straw. Use the straw test and work on this one. Do you feel the difference, right? Like, it's not like we're eliminating panning completely. Like some of the questions, you still have to pan to read the questions. You still have to move around a little bit. But the degree to which we have to pan to get around that interface is like completely minimized, right? We're in a much better situation now. And it happens to work really well on a mobile. So if you look at the way that these things are chunked, we don't have two questions together and two sets of answers together. We've got question and answer together. They are visually related. We talk about, for people that use screen readers, we think of the programmatic side of accessibility a lot. So if anybody's in here is like a developer or talks with developers all the time, we're always talking about what we need to do in the code. All of accessibility is not contained within code. It's also contained within design. I would actually venture a guess that yes, people with low vision, they have a reliance on the programmatic side of accessibility, but they also have a reliance on the visual and spatial relationships that we create in a design. So that's even more important for someone that has low vision than it is for somebody, for somebody that is completely blind and using a screen reader. Is that all making sense so far? Right? We have created a really good pattern of use here as well. If I magnify this, that pattern of use as we're using this, we're going straight down and we are putting people directly on that call to action that we want them to take. And you also might notice we did a little something different with the quit or the go back or the previous buttons. We've created we've muted them a little bit in the interface by making them not so prominent. They don't have the same visual weight anymore, right? This makes this a much better design for someone with low vision. If you even squinted at the screen and made this all blurry, you would be able to tell which the primary call to action is. So that's the thing that we call the straw test. We've been doing that straw test for years, and that comes from lots of experience. And remember I said at the beginning of this little segment, this comes from a place of knowing. We have done lots of usability testing with people with low vision, and they've actually in many ways described this to us as they've literally said, it's like I'm looking through a straw at the screen. And I thought that is one of the most powerful analogies that we could ever have for understanding a little bit about what the experience of low vision is. So again, remember, when we use this straw test, we use it on wireframes, on mock-ups, on things that are in production. We use it on pencil sketches of interfaces. We use this all the time to help identify design-related issues that are going to be a problem for people with low vision earlier in the process. I would encourage you to use this as much as you can. We have little cards that we have sometimes when we do like the full day workshop. We'll give people a set of cards for this. But you can literally just do what we did. Look through a pretend straw at the screen. You can literally look through a straw if you wanted to. You can punch a little hole in a card. Lots of different approaches for this. But people have said this to us, and so this does come from a place of knowing. I didn't just make this thing up. This is actually from experiences of working with people with different forms of low vision. So when we talk about that design, and you saw that design, this happens. People say this to me almost at the end of every workshop. They're like, all this stuff that you just taught us. Yes, we made that thing more accessible, but that thing is that's a better design now. Period. Right? Like that's a better design. I'm like, yes, exactly. One of the things that I believe is that if we take these cases and project these extremes, like looking through a straw, that's a pretty extreme scenario, right? When we project that onto a design problem and we solve for that problem, we end up with a design that ends up being better for everyone. So we've kind of got these extremes that we can build into our design work. And we're going to look at a few here. So we're going to look at this one. So another extreme is that you cannot see a really critical visual in an interface. And I'll give you an example of what that means. So this is a map. This is a fictitious example. This is a real map of the city of Ottawa and a couple of polygons that kind of go around it. I'm from Ottawa, Canada. So that's home for me. Ultimately, we've got this map with these two polygons that are overlapping on here. And we were working with a team, and they said, we're working on this map. We know we need to make it accessible, but we're not really sure how. And they said, this map is a very visual tool. We're not really sure what to use for a text equivalent for that visual. We're not really sure how to go about making the map accessible. So they understood how to make the map accessible itself, to make sure that the map was keyboard accessible, that you could operate all the controls and a lot of other pieces. But what they didn't understand was, how do we make this text equivalent for these overlapping polygons? And like, cool, let's talk about that. We started throwing out some ideas. And so one of the ideas was we could have a text-based description of each of the polygons. And so something reasonable might be something like this. The city of Ottawa is bounded to the north by the Ottawa River. It extends, the boundary extends to the west as far as, 73 kilometers to Arnprior. Not 73 kilometers, so I should convert that into miles for you. I think that's like 3 miles, I think. No, it's not 3 miles. It extends, it might be like 32 miles along the Ottawa River to the west to Arnprior, where the boundary then turns inward and heads southwest for 3 miles, and at which point it then heads southeast for 64 miles and forms a point at such and such a place. And they kind of went through this process of describing that polygon. And then they said, then we need to describe the second polygon. So they went through the same process for that. I said, cool. What else have you got? They said, well, the purpose of this is kind of a little bit, it's just as much about the difference between the two, right? So we're showing not just the polygons, we're showing that they're overlapping. And here's this new piece. And so they said maybe a reasonable text equivalent would be to describe the delta, right? And so the difference between these two polygons is that and I'm really simplifying it, but on the southwest border of the city, it extends, by 5 miles further. On the southeast, it extends 15 miles further. And then in the easternmost corner, it forms a new shape, describe the shape and of, X number of square miles extending out to such and such a place, right? So they had come up with different ways of describing it. They even said these polygons are really just a bunch of latitude and longitude coordinates that are all connected. So they said, would it be a reasonable text equivalent for us to say, take those, take that data and provide that to people? And I said, sure, why not? Like, they might take it in and put it into some other mapping tool that is really highly accessible to them, right? So take that in and use it there. I said, all of those are great ideas on how to make this interface more accessible. And they said, cool, which one do we choose? I said, I don't know. What's the purpose of the map? Like, why is the map on the page in the first place? You know what they said? They said, well, because that's what it says in the spec that we have to build. I'm like, nope. Why is the map there? What is its value, right? And they came up with this. They said, well, the number one reason that people want to know if this border change or this city boundary change impacts them, it's all about taxes, right? If they're going to be inside the new boundary, their taxes are going up. If they're outside the new boundary, taxes are going to stay the same. That was like the number one use case that they had for putting this map out there, was to help people fix this up. So what we looked at by looking at this thing, and I said, okay, well, if that's the case, how might we approach this? What could we do if this most important visual thing is missing on the page, right? So the extreme that I talked about in the beginning was you cannot see a critical visual. Like, the most important thing on this page are those two polygons, right? That's where all the information is. That's the value of this page. So we got to the point where we started asking this question, right? What happens if that thing is not there? How would you solve this problem? And they said, well, if the most important thing for this is for somebody to determine whether or not this impacts them, why don't we just do something like this, where we provide a postal code lookup? And they instantly created something that was way more accessible, way more usable by everybody, and more useful for everybody. And they created a mechanism that wasn't all focused on the text equivalent. It was focused on, how do we achieve this outcome? The outcome that people were after, the 90% use case, was, am I impacted by this or not? Now, they still ended up describing the boundaries in text, right? They decided that that was the best way to do it, but that wouldn't have given people the things that they needed to determine whether or not this impacted them. Because even if they had a text description, what they needed to do was go and decode where the boundary was and relative to their house. Does that make sense? Right, so the mechanism that they created and this extra piece, when I said this is probably the best way to go and still do the text equivalent, they're like, I wish we had thought of that 6 months ago. I'm like, I wish you thought of it 6 months ago too. Like, it would have been way better to be thinking about this back then. So that's one extreme that we use when looking at any design. Take the most important visual thing that's on there, and what do you do if that was eliminated? How do you achieve the same goals, right? The other extreme that we've talked about so far is this limited view of the screen, and that is using the straw test. So I'll give you a couple of other examples, and then we're going to dig in and do one. This is a table of data. This is like solar system. It's planet data. And so if you take a look, you see this basic grid here. So we've got down the left-hand side, the planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. This was at the time when you weren't a planet, even though you're like complete identity crisis for Pluto. Like, am I in or not? Right? I don't feel very included here. So I'm not. This is maybe I need to add that in because this is not very inclusive. And across the top, planet, diameter, distance to sun, time for one orbit, time for one spin, the average temperature, and the number of moons. And one of the things that we know from working with people with low vision, when they look at tables of data, it's often hard for them to understand context because we think of that proximity issue. If I asked you to look at one of those number 10s, in fact, I'm gonna magnify this. If I ask you to tell me what that number 10 represents, now that I'm magnified, this is the same thing as using the straw test, right? You've got to work a lot to go back and figure out what the column header is and what the row header is. So we created a mechanism, and it's an experimental thing, but by looking at this and understanding what it might be like to have low vision, we came up with this idea, and it's basically this, that when we hover over a table cell, and we would need to make this keyboard accessible as well, don't get me wrong, but when we hover over a table cell, we get this little call to action that when you click it, it brings in the column header and the row header so that you can reestablish that context and don't have those same proximity issues. Now, for a small table like this, it's not really, it's not like super hard to work with this one. But if you think of taking this, and I'll just kind of show you a quick video of it here so you can see what happens. We just, as we're moving around, we literally just click on this little call to action. It pulls in those row and column headers. Its impact is minimal here, but if you think of a table that has like hundreds and hundreds of rows in it and many columns, its impact is actually much greater because its utility is much greater. We came up with this idea only literally by understanding and working with people with low vision and how they sometimes struggled with massive tables of data. Every single person that we've worked with that I've shown this to that doesn't have low vision, but that works with big tables of data, they're like, I want that. Like, that would make my job so much easier, right? I literally believe this to the very core of my being, that if we design for these, and I'm calling them extremes, they're not necessarily that extreme. For some people, they're like everyday happenings, right? But if we think of them as these really extreme cases and we design and solve for that, we end up making things that are better for everyone. We had some other versions of it as well, where we would pull in like the entire header column or the entire header row, because for some things, doing a comparison, like the task that you might be trying to complete, is about comparing one thing to another, right? Comparing one planet to another. So in this case, we pulled in that entire first column, or we pulled in the entire first row to bring them all there. There's lots of different variations. So again, we figured that out using the straw test, and that's a thing that we're going to do right now. So I'm going to give you this just as a quick, super fun thing. I can see the looks on your faces already, that like you're all smiles and happy and ready for this. I'm going to give you a fairly simple task, and this seems like a pretty innocuous graph. We're going to redesign this graph, and we're going to do it in like rapid fire succession. Okay, so this is, get ready. You might want to have a little piece of paper because you might want to sketch this out. But here's what we're going to do. If you take a look at this, I'm going to give you a simple task, and we'll call it simple, even though it might not be. Using the straw test, what we are going to do is complete this task. Compare the GDP annual growth percentage in 2009 of India and the Russian Federation. Now, y'all are cheating because you're already looking at it, and I did that, I set that up. But use the straw test and go through the motions of what it takes to compare the 2009 annual growth GDP between India and the Russian Federation. So that should not have been a great experience, and some of you are still doing this. What I would like for you to do, and there's another one, we're going to only do one option here. I normally get you to do the same thing with this form, but we're going to stick to the graph because we're like micro workshopping. So here's what we're going to do. Super hands-on. We're going to take about 5 or 6 minutes to do this. On your own with a partner or two, whichever you prefer, however you like to work, this is up to you. Choose the graph, the wireframe, or your own interaction. Just choose the graph. And what I would like you to do is you've used the straw test now to see what that experience was like. I'll put it back up on the screen for you so that you can kind of revisit it. Sketch some, and even if you don't think you can sketch, right? It doesn't take that much. The cool thing is I'm not going to come around and look at them all, so completely judgment-free. You can sketch, and if you want to explain or just write out what you would do differently, totally fine, right? That is like, you can sketch with words if you want to. Think of 2, 3, 1, I don't know, whatever number of things that you would do to improve the design specifically for people with low vision, okay? Based on using that straw test. Does that make sense? Okay, and then be prepared to share. We won't share as much as we normally do because I normally do this with like 25 people and we've got all day. We'll do a couple of shares. So I'm going to just jump back to here so that you have that as a reference. And you don't have to re-sketch the entire interface. And I also would put a parameter on it. You're not allowed to say, I would just start over, right? Because like most of you would probably just, I would just start over, right? So it's not that. Think of little tweaks that you can make to the design and sketch those out really quickly. Hey Siri, set a timer for 5 minutes.
Your timer is set for 5 minutes.
For the exercise, would you recommend modeling existing formats?
Yes.
Or applying more accessible alternatives alongside existing formats? Because table or all graphs are just visual representations of graphic information. So we have an accessible graph format, but not graph format, a table format, allowing our applications to do that information.
So good, absolutely. Big picture, yes. That won't make it that much better for someone full vision.
I'm also thinking that there's a large percentage of people that apply graphs as image formats. So
Yes.
the amount of work it would take to try to make an image format more accessible might be more burdensome than just simply allowing.
What we often do with graphs is we have a three-way toggle. Control graph, control the table there, control both together. And that's pretty typical. For this one, think about and focus on the proximity aspects that come up with the straw test. I mean, you're not wrong. Just think of the straw test type stuff when you're tweaking it.
I also worked on like a lot of the content management for our sites. So I know
That's
all
stuff is
the
in your
bad
brain.
things that people do and stuff. So
Yes, indeed.
frankly, playing that.
Yeah. So have you had a chance to sketch out some little things that you might change? Some of you might have been like, I know he said don't redo the whole thing, but I'm redoing the whole thing anyway. I totally get it. I totally get it. All right, we got about 30 seconds left, so just wrap up anything that you're working on. Again, normally we would spend like 15 minutes on this, and we would sketch them. I would get you to come up here and share and show people. We'll just talk through it really quickly with the micro workshop. So some of you have probably come up with alternatives or little things that you would tweak in this design that might even have nothing to do with low vision, right? They might actually be for some other, for some other reason that you want to make this accessible in some other way. Like this, images like this or charts or graphs like this are often static images, and they're captured and they're frozen, and you don't have access to the underlying data that's in them. That tends to be a thing that is, it helps with people with low vision, but that tends to be for people that are more on the like screen reading side of low vision, not so much on the proximity side. So remember, we're doing things here that are all about the straw test in the proximity side. So any volunteers for like a thing that you saw as a barrier for someone with low vision from the proximity side of things, and then a tweak that you made to the design that might make that better? Any volunteers? Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if it's just me. I think I'm realizing I might need to get my eyes checked. But when I was looking through the straw, I really struggled with the color. So that was a big issue in identifying which country was which. I just suggest making a simple bar graph where you clustered all the countries together in a bar graph, and each country was represented within the graph, and then you would just move each year with a separate graph.
So let me restate and paraphrase, because all of that was good, but I'm going to try and get that in 5 seconds. Color was a difficult thing, particularly when looking through the straw. Difficult to distinguish one country from another, and therefore perhaps a different style of graph would be a better choice. Absolutely, totally one of those things. Anybody have anything that was not one of those?
So, not actually changing the graph at all, but going down, kind of like the pieces with the, where you can drop down some like, country points there and all there.
So what's the kind of the barrier, the thing that wasn't good about the design that made you want to create that?
Well, just like color was hard to see, and then from this is just going to draw, even reading the percentages on the side,
So if I can paraphrase, I'll try to paraphrase. Multiple things made it very difficult. Color was difficult. Also, reading the scales on the side was difficult, and therefore creating something within kind of a very small defined area where you could have all the data there that you were specifically after. Go ahead.
We had the color scheme and the bar graph, but also each bar, the different color, but each bar needs to be shaded so that it's the shape of a shade. So if you're colorblind, there's still a distinction in each bar. And then when you can go through that bar and have a data box that pops up that will give you that particular information.
So color, not just using color, but also using something like shape and pattern. I've over-indexed on everything here. This is not a good graph, but I kind of went I'll make a dotted one, and I'll make a dashed one, and I'll make a dot dash dash one, and I'll do but we could use pattern in some way, shape, or form. We've got shape in there as well. And when you hover the mouse over a particular point, that we get a data box there, right? As I watched you kind of going through this process, one of the things that I'm always really, really cognizant of is watching the motion that people take. And so I watched people go down to the legend and then come back up to try and find the right line, and then go follow along, try to find 2009, and then get to the point that they were after, and then go all the way across to the scale, and then come back, and then go back down to the legend, and then find the other line. That's a lot of work to make that happen. Some of the other things that we could do with this, and I'll give you some of the things that people have come up with in previous versions of the workshop, is that we put the legend right on the right-hand side so that it actually sits right beside each line. So it just says the name of the country there so that it's much easier to identify. One of the other things, did you notice that, I picked 2009, which is almost all the way at the far right of the graph, right? In order to read the scale, you had to go all the way over to the left-hand side. There is no reason that you couldn't have the scale on both sides so that it was much less distance to get to, right? There's a whole lot of things that you could do. Those are all great suggestions and great ideas. I want you to think of, anytime we're talking about proximity and thinking about the straw test, think about the placement of things, right? What is the layout of this thing? Where could these things live differently on the screen or on the page so that they're in a more convenient place? You may not end up putting them in that place because that might end up having a negative impact on somebody else. But we need to explore those things, right? What alternative or what different layouts might we have that would make this proximity issue not as difficult? One of the other things that we use often, so we talked about the straw test, we also use something called the equator test and one called the meridian test. And so the equator test is take your screen and cut it in half like the equator. The meridian test is take your screen, cut it in half vertically like the prime meridian. And one of the things that we have found is in order to complete a task, if you cross over the equator more than once or twice, it's going to be a difficult task to complete for someone with low vision. It's also very likely to be a more difficult task for someone to complete that relies on a keyboard. Right? Because if we're crossing over the equator multiple times to complete an interaction, then that means we have tabbed forward and we have tabbed backwards and maybe even forward again. If that is a requirement to complete an interaction, that is maybe a very difficult interaction with a poor keyboard flow. And by the same token, if we cross not just the equator, but the meridian, if we are crossing the meridian multiple times to complete a task, it's much easier to lose context. Think of that multi-column form, right? If we cross over that meridian more than twice, it's probably a more difficult task. So can we find ways to minimize that? If you think of that simple task of of finding those points and the legend being down at the bottom, we have to cross over multiple times across the equator. If you think of finding those points and following along to the scale, we're crossing over that meridian multiple times. If we localized a lot of that stuff on the right-hand side for that particular task, we minimize the number of times that we cross the equator and the meridian. So some simple tests that you can apply to a design. And again, they don't replace working with real people. They're just things that you can use as like early things in your design that you can use to help make your design better so that when you do test for real with people with disabilities, you have a better chance of success. I'd also love for you to design for Andre or Fezzik. So Andre is Andre the Giant, who played the character Fezzik in The Princess Bride. So hopefully everybody in here knows maybe one of those two characters. If you don't know those characters, this is Andre the Giant. Andre the Giant was a professional wrestler, and like full disclosure, this is what I grew up with, and so I go back here every time I can. Andre the Giant was 7'4" and about 570 pounds. He was a big dude. This is his signature move, which he called, "I'm going to take you and put your noses in my armpits." This was like, he was just a big guy. And if that doesn't give you context, this is a scene from The Princess Bride where he is here with Mandy Patinkin and Carrie Elwes. And you can see the difference in the size of his head compared to theirs. He's just a really big dude. And so I want to, and if you haven't seen The Princess Bride, what a wonderful movie. Watch that because all of the feels, right? Now, I wanted to kind of help you understand a little bit more about what it might be like to design for Andre or Fezzik. And so I was trying to find something about his hands, right? Let's design something that works well for Andre or for Fezzik in terms of a touch screen. And I was like, okay, well, let's put these things up here. This might give some context. And this is his hand with another person's, but you don't know who that other person is. And so therefore you can't really tell how big his hand is. I thought I could show his hand holding this beer can. This is an old school beer can, but it's also Canadian. So that's like no good because that's like a metric beer. And you probably don't know what size that is. So I came up with this and I thought this might help you understand the size of Andre's hands.
Big giant! Hungry for a big hunting day. Big day, honeycomb, big day. Honeycomb, big, waves on storm. Honeycomb sky, big honeycomb, big fly, big pie. Honeycomb cereal, arms big, deep breakfast. Honeycomb, big pie. Yeah!
Now, part of that was because I just can't resist a good 80s commercial, right? Like, I had to get that in there, but I showed that to you for a couple of reasons. One was this. I don't know if you saw this in there, but this is the average size of a honeycomb. The average size of a honeycomb is about 1 inch across, right? I statistically verified this by consuming 75 boxes of honeycomb, and it's for real. Now, this was also in there, and this gives us now a measurable reference. Sorry, it's kind of creeping me out a little bit, so we'll go in there. So if we know that a honeycomb is roughly 1 inch across, we know that Andre the Giant's finger pads are roughly 1 inch across. So if we take that and start to think about touch interfaces, and we think about how he might use that touch interface, the average size of an average human size finger pad is somewhere between 10 and 14 millimeters across, right? Andre's, and if you think of an Apple Watch at 42 millimeters, and we then extrapolate Andre the Giant's fingers to be 25 millimeters across, so 1 inch is 25.4 millimeters. So his finger pad is roughly 1 inch across, and if we put that on this interface, that doesn't work anymore. So I often ask this, if you were designing an Apple Watch and you were designing it so that Andre could use it, what might you do differently for that home screen interface on the Apple Watch where we've got all these little tiny icons? Like, how might you design that differently? Any thoughts? Any quick thoughts?
A carousel would be a
Yeah, a carousel where maybe we just got like one thing at a time, right? And so that would be like an interface transformation. How can we transform that interface so instead of that, we've just got an easy mechanism for him to click through. One of the other things that they have on this is like, voiceovers on there or Siri is on there. So he could easily just say, hey, open this app or whatever it is that he needs to do. But most people go to something like that. Actually, most people that I talk with, they say like, he wouldn't wear a watch. He'd like put duct tape on an iPhone and he would put that on his wrist, right? But we can come up with different ways of looking at that interface. So if we look at this interface, this is an interface here. It's a search in the city of Ottawa for I'm looking for ice time, right? Because I'm going to rent out a rink to take my kids skating and some of their friends. We were doing this at New Year's. We had a bunch of friends coming over, and I'm like, I'll spend like $100 on ice time, and we'll have 30 of us out there skating. It'll be awesome. So we did that, and I did this search, and this is the page that I get. So I want you to take a look at this screen. You can see all of the results there. You can see the checkboxes on the right-hand side and the view details links, and you can see this pagination along the bottom. We have these pagination links. So we're going to do the Andre the Giant test. So Andre's finger pads were about 25 millimeters or 1 inch wide. Make your design easier for Andre to use on a touch screen. So really quick, hands-on again. We're going to do this in about literally 5 or 6 minutes. So we're going to look at that search results page. You're going to find some things that you think are going to be difficult for Andre to do, and you're going to just sketch some alternatives for it, and then we'll share that quickly. Does that all make sense? We'll go about 5 minutes again, and I'll leave this interface on the screen for you. And again, you can do this on your own. You can do this in small groups, whatever makes the most sense for you, whatever makes you feel the most appropriate. Excuse me.
Oh, yeah.
We'll go for about 2 more minutes. 2 more minutes. 1 minute. 1 minute. Alrighty. Keep in mind and remember, we are looking at this interface and we are projecting a very specific extreme onto it. That does not mean that we do just that extreme and that we think only about that particular disability, right? We're like this screen, this interface would need to be accessible to everybody, right? But we're looking at just some extremes. I'm giving you some examples. Particularly, these examples are hopefully like really obvious so that it helps you recognize these patterns down the road. So anybody want to go first with one thing that you changed or one thing that you sketched as a different thing? Go ahead.
Well, recognizing that things need to be bigger. Taking out that whole first column of the information and displaying that differently so you have more room to work with.
So potentially changing that first column and organizing it differently so that we have more room to work with. One thing, and I agree, one thing that you can't see on here is that these all happened to be at that one location, but there you could easily do a search that ended up with things coming back from multiple locations. That doesn't invalidate your point, but it's a thing to consider because we might actually be much better off. Instead of one long table that has 87 rows in it, we might be better with, here is a heading for this location and all the data for that location, right? We might do it that way and split things up. So absolutely 100% gets us some more room to work with. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
So the view details part is really tiny for someone with a bigger finger, and so instead of making that link the only way to view details, making the whole box, the whole like graph part, so if it clicks on that, another text box pops up with those details without having to like find them literally with his finger.
So to paraphrase, that view details link is quite tiny and it's also quite cramped. So giving that some breathing room, making it bigger, making the whole thing touchable or tappable so that when we do that, then it brings up those details rather than having it be on this little tiny link. Yeah, go ahead.
Couple of things. First of all, I'm assuming at the very top of this page, you could tell it how to sort the information.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm thinking that it's by place, but could you have also done it by date or by time? You know, that it's available. But I also was thinking moving the checkboxes over to the other side, or at least closer to the location or the selection that you want.
So two things. One thing that we think is there, which is some sortability at the top, which will help people consume this in a much better way. And yes, the interface does have that. You can't see it right now, but it is there. And then also potentially changing the location of the checkboxes to make those maybe more over closer to the actual data. Go ahead.
Eliminating the checkboxes and buttons instead.
Eliminating the checkboxes and using buttons instead. What? Tell me about that benefit or why that would be useful.
Eliminating checkboxes, I mean, trying to tap that with the finger can be really difficult if the finger is larger. Like, it's hard sometimes to get them to actually be selected.
Right. So because the size checkboxes are tiny, might be hard to do with depending on the size of your finger. It's very fine and difficult to do. So maybe a button might be a better control. One thing to keep in mind is that what they end up doing with this is they're adding things. So they might be like, check off, I want this size time, this size time, and this size time, and then add all four of them. So a button might need a slightly different, might mean that like the architecture of the whole app might need to change, right? in order to do that, which is totally fine. But there's sometimes the changes that we kind of envision have like these other cascading effects as well. Go ahead.
Make the height of each of those boxes higher, larger, so that the checkboxes are not so close together. You remove that link to the date, which I don't understand.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the date is, like why it's even there, but yeah, so make each row a little bit larger itself so that the checkboxes aren't so cramped. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'd make those pagination options not as close to each other and not as close to that add button there. I feel like he'd be tapping add when he would have next or last.
Yeah, definitely. So those pagination controls are basically screaming at every one of us, right? Like they are all there's zero breathing room between them, and we've got like these constructive actions like right next to potentially destructive. Like at least it's not an add and a delete like right next to one another, but very easy to click add when he was trying to click last. Right, so usually making those things a little bit bigger and giving them some breathing room. I would definitely spend some time, redesigning that pagination. So that was all awesome. You're pros at this. You should like just keep doing this. So that was like all inclusive design, like the product. How do we build more inclusive products? And part of that is like just exposing our minds to different ways of thinking about an interface and some of the things that we can do. I want to dive into, for the last 35 minutes, to get into the process piece. So the first thing we're going to do on the process side is we're going to envision ourselves doing a little bit of something here with Twister, not Twitter, Twister. If you're not familiar with Twister as a game, it's so much fun. Basically, you get a big mat out on the floor. It's probably like 6 feet by 6 feet, and it has a bunch of colored dots on it. And then ultimately, what you do is you spin. This is a game from like the 1960s, so you can imagine what they were thinking when they came up with this. But ultimately, you would spin this little spinner, and you would say, and you can kind of see here. So left foot with all the colors, right hand with all the colors, left hand with all the colors, right foot with all the colors. So ultimately what you would do is I would spin and it would say right foot blue. So I would have to put my right foot on the blue, and then somebody else would spin and they would have to go. And then everybody's bodies get kind of tangled up and you're falling all over each other. And it's a party game. So it is what it is. My kids actually have a version of Twister that they play, and it's hilarious. Like it's actually quite fun. I was going to show some of the commercials from Twister, like I showed Honeycomb, and I was like, yeah, I can't show that. That's not good. So ultimately, think of your Twister board as like a 6 foot by 6 foot or 7 foot by 7 foot thing that goes on the floor. Now, what we're going to do is to rethink Twister a little bit here. So our goal is to create an accessible game of Twister that anybody can play. So we're going to very quickly identify a barrier to participation for seeing or hearing, dexterity, mobility, speech, memory, language. Pick any kind of any type of disability that you want to think of, and think of what a barrier to participation might be for somebody that has that particular disability. Right? So mobility, for example, there's a difference between mobility and dexterity. So mobility might be like gross motor control or movements where I might be in a wheelchair or on a scooter, or I might require crutches full time. Dexterity is like fine motor control. Like it might be really hard for someone to, I'm kind of leading the witness here, but it might be really hard for someone to flick that spinner because of their fine motor control related issues, right? So they might not have the dexterity to flick that spinner. So flicking the spinner, as an example, is a barrier to participation for somebody that might have dexterity related issues. Make sense? So what we're going to do is spend a couple of minutes thinking about this. Just literally thinking through it in your head. Write down a barrier to participation for somebody with one or many of these disabilities. And then think about how you might eliminate that barrier to increase inclusion and participation. So you're not allowed to use this one, but I said, for someone with dexterity-related issues, flicking that little spinner might be very difficult. So what we might do is we might create an app that allows us to have like an electronic spinner that happens just by somebody touching the screen once, or some other command, or they could connect it to a switch if they happen to not have dexterity. So you're not allowed to use that one, but that's the kind of thing that we're doing. Like, so the barrier is somebody doesn't have the dexterity to flick the spinner, and we're going to create an app that goes with it to replace that. Does that make sense? So I promise you this is lots of fun. So go ahead and spend like 2 or 3 minutes on that.
I just wanted to check in how far through their presentation you are.
We're right on track to finish. We're about 2/3 of the way through.
Okay.
So.
Hi.
Okay, about 30 seconds left. Wrap up your thoughts on what you're working on. All right, So let's share a little bit of this, preferably from some people who haven't had a chance to contribute that would like to. If you haven't had a chance to contribute and you're not interested in that, that's totally fine. If you'd rather even just tweet some of these things out at me, that's totally fine as well, because I can connect on them after the fact. So on the Twister side of things, what is, say, a barrier that you thought of to participation, and what did you do to kind of go solve for that issue? Go ahead.
So we have actually talked about an issue potentially, because even like as a kid, I remember trying to get like a foot by my head and being like, what is this? What are we doing right now?
Yeah.
This is just yoga, dangerous yoga. So the thought process we kind of had would be like potentially having the actual playing surface being partially on the wall, part of it being on the floor, so that way something who might be like a wheelchair would be able to roll to the top, like have a material that they can actually go to the top of, and to where they can actually interact and be fit in their chair as they put.
Very cool.
That could, prevent foot step on ear syndrome as well.
Yeah. I'll paraphrase just so that gets out to everybody. So the thought was mobility might be a challenge, and then you were recounting wonderful thoughts of dangerous yoga in your childhood, where like foot near head is actually very difficult for somebody to do. And so the thinking on it was maybe that we have a modified board, or we have a board that is on the ground but also partially goes up a wall to help us take into account some of those scenarios where somebody might be able to participate by putting some body part on the wall and other parts on the floor as well. And it's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, at the back. Yep.
With the emotional disability, with the PTSD, and like that, not wanting to be that close proximity to people, you have separate acts.
Yeah, so for someone with some kind of emotional PTSD or other, like somebody mentioned this in the last one that I did, that was just like, and I can't remember the word that you used, but it could just be like, I'm going to make this up, but like extreme introversion, right? Like I don't want to be with other people necessarily, but I still want to participate. So maybe there's the idea of a separate mat for somebody else to participate on their own, and their participation isn't tied to being entangled with other people. It could strictly be like they're in weird positions and like contortionist on their own, right? And so that may be a really great way to kind of approach it. Anybody else? Go ahead.
So, two things. One is if it's the person's visually impaired, then the mat would have, instead of all the circles, it would be moved and ridges and shaped. And
So let me paraphrase that one, and then we'll come back to the second one. So for someone that's visually impaired, the shapes might also have some texture to them, or a tactile feeling, where there's like grooves or ridges or something like that. And then what's your second one?
And it told us not to come back to the spinner, but if there was a spinner of some sort, it would announce the color and the shape. So the person would know where to go. So the mat would then have counts also for the vision move forward. Fine.
Right. So I'm totally fine with you going back to the spinner, because I was thinking of the spinner just purely from a dexterity issue. You came up with a completely different application of the spinner, which was for someone that's visually impaired and benefit to more people, but a spinner that actually announces the color and the body part, so that can be announced to everyone. Anybody? We'll do one more. Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking if you were hearing impaired and you're playing Twister, you won't be able to see something like if somebody wrote down what it was, because you're going to be, like your skill that thing your stuff. So I was thinking of like little, you could redesign that, like little LED lights that would light up for whatever row or your body part.
So potentially something for someone that's hearing impaired. We have some visual reinforcement on the mat itself, like some LED lights that help you figure out what move to make next. We could do this all day, and you probably all came up with lots of really, really interesting things. I love that. So I will say that was mostly inclusive design thinking, right? We're throwing ideas around, we're designing, we're coming up with different scenarios. When I say that it's inclusive design thinking, even if you are in here solving problems, if you have a disability yourself and you are solving a problem for you, the reason that I talk about it is mostly inclusive design thinking is that we haven't necessarily gone out and canvassed a group of people with a whole lot of variety of disabilities and talked and worked with them. So I've worked with many designers who are not visual designers, but they're still designing systems and products and things like that have visual impairment. And they are really, really good at solving and understanding the problems that they might face with a particular product. But what we need to do is, and I say this for literally everybody, we all need to get outside of our own heads a little bit more. So to practice inclusive design, even though we might have a disability ourselves, we need to get outside of that frame of reference that we have that is us and start thinking about and working with other people, and not just thinking about how other people might see a barrier, because we might make an assumption that, oh, that thing's a barrier, and it may not be, right? We only find that out from talking with multiple people, multiple times over a longer period of time. So we can take that inclusive design thinking, and that is valuable, right? Everything that we did in the first half as well, in terms of the straw test, the equator test, the meridian test, the Andre the Giant test, a lot of that is inclusive design thinking as well, things that lead us to create better products. But we still need to validate all of those things. Those things don't replace working with people with disabilities. So what do we do to take this inclusive design thinking and have that lead to actually be an inclusive design practice? And ultimately what we need to do is to kind of take some action on this, work with people with disabilities as co-designers. And I don't just mean work with one person with a disability that you happen to know and work with already. Like, let's broaden this out, right? Notice that people is a plural, right? Let's not work with person with disabilities as a co-designer or a participant in the design process. We need to include multiple people with all kinds of different perspectives. Again, when we talk about inclusive design, remember, I'm talking about it from the lens of accessibility for people with disabilities. There are multiple lessons in here that apply to other forms or lenses of inclusion. I'm just thinking particularly about people with disabilities. So to do this, we need to embrace diversity by default, right? Diversity has to be our default position. So there's a great quote or phrase that comes from this South African gentleman, Michael Masutha, from the early 1990s. And he was talking about how people with disabilities were involved. And his simple phrase, he and another gentleman, also from South Africa, kind of convened on this, or they converged on this concept of nothing about us without us, right? If you are making decisions about something that impacts me, then I should be able to participate in that. And people say this to me all the time, right? Derek, honestly, we aren't excluding people intentionally. And my number one reaction is, and it's not defensive, it's just literally this, right? Yes, but you're not including them intentionally either. So this intentional inclusion is where we need to go. And we do that by enabling participation in the process of design itself. I don't care exactly what your design process is, because that piece doesn't matter. We all, at each organization that we work with, we might have a different design process, right? So the exact process doesn't matter, it's inclusion that matters. And I'll give you a really quick example of what I'm thinking about here. This is an article, this came out a while ago, a few years ago, and it's BuzzFeed's design process, and it was posted on Medium. I love process. Like, process is a thing that I can really dig into, because I can see how somebody approaches a problem, and then I'm like, here's what we can do there to make that better. This would make it more inclusive. This would make it more inclusive. This would make it more inclusive. And we can inject things into an existing design process. But they talked about something like this basic process of define, explore, refine, build, and learn. And they said, people often represent it as like these sprints, but that's not reality. It's really much more like this. Like we define the problem, we're exploring the problem space a little bit. Then we go back to definition, we explore a bit more, we build some things, we refine, we build some more, we learn from it, and we continue on, right? This is much more realistic. It's not nearly as linear and simplistic as many people make it. But they talked about this really interesting learning cycle that they go through, and it was gather, synthesize, make, and communicate. And so they've got this in this kind of circular iterative mode. And so for one of the things that they said, they were going to explore some user flows. And so they said they were going to gather Basecamp feedback, including responses to open questions, as well as feedback from the team. They were going to synthesize where iterations need to be made to the whiteboard sketch. They were going to scope possible user paths and scenarios for the project. They were going to make another version of the user flows in higher fidelity using Sketch to clarify details. They were going to communicate via a Basecamp post and do a presentation to the team. So that's part of their design process. And so what I see here is a whole bunch of touch points. Basecamp, right? We see Basecamp here. Whiteboarding, doing an actual presentation to the team, right? I love this. It's like there's all these little touch points that are part of the process. But I have questions about each one of these. Is Basecamp accessible? What do we do for whiteboarding? How do we include somebody that cannot see or hear that presentation? What happens for someone that cannot maybe write on a whiteboard? We do this whiteboarding session. The assumption tends to be that everybody is standing up. Well, but everybody doesn't stand up, right? So the design process itself has some exclusion built into it, right? This is one of the things that we need to examine. So it doesn't really matter what your process is. I throw this out as a very loosely defined design process: project concept, user research, design iteration, development and iteration, and validation and launch. You can call it whatever you want, right? Again, as I said, it really doesn't matter. The goal is, how do we enable participation in the process itself, right? And so what I tend to do is do two things. One is we create a tool inventory. When you look at your design process, what are the tools that you're using? So some people use things like real-time board and post-it notes. They do phone interviews and they do in-person interviews as part of their design process. Which pieces of that are exclusive by their nature? How many meetings have you gone to? You know design is happening when you go into a place, into a room, and you see a whole bunch of post-it notes on the wall, right? That's like proof positive that design was happening. And what's the very first thing that happens at the end of that meeting? Someone goes, they pull out their camera, they take a photo, and they post it somewhere and say, cool, we've now got a record of everything that we did in that meeting. What they've done is basically taken a thing that was not necessarily accessible, and they have encoded it into a digital format that is also not necessarily accessible. Right? So one of the things that we typically do is we'll look at the tools that we're using. So if one of the tools we use regularly is something like post-it notes, we might need to understand that somebody with dexterity-related issues, for some reason they don't have fine motor control, they might not be able to use post-it notes. They don't work for them, right? Because they're finicky and they're difficult, or somebody might have, and I make stuff up all the time, but think about things like somebody maybe has a prosthetic. That means that it's very difficult to remove a post-it note from the stack, right? Maybe that's the case. For someone that does phone interviews, right, as part of one of their tools that they use as part of their design, how does that work for someone that's deaf or hard of hearing? Can someone that's deaf or hard of hearing actually participate in the process using the tool set that we have defined? So we do two things, usually a tool inventory and we do a process and methods inventory. So the tools are one side, right, like physical things or techniques that you use, and then there's process and methods inventory. So we typically do something like this. We do journey mapping activities, we do discussions and interviews, we do design prototypes, we do functional prototypes. How do we take all of that and make it so that people with all of these different disabilities, and we're not even, like, this is only like 6 very, very broad categories of disabilities. 5 very, very broad categories of disabilities there. We're not even really drilling down on anybody that maybe has autism or different forms of being on the spectrum on there. We're not taking any of that into account, but we might take into account memory or language or attention or all kinds of other things. All right, so what we typically do, and we've only got about 10 minutes left, so normally what I do is get you to do this, and I'm going to leave this for you as homework because I used to be a teacher, so like that's what you do. Like you're good. Of course, it was always planned that this was going to be homework, but I would encourage you to take this away and to go look, like literally go through and fill out these grids. All right, what are the tools and the processes that we're using, and how are there barriers that are built into that, and how do we get through those barriers? I'm going to also give you kind of an example. And literally, this is one that this is one that I already had cooking in the oven. This was one that we have filled out in the past, just to give you an idea. And I don't want, again, think of these as examples, not like the exact thing that you need, but just as an example, mapping activities. Mapping activities, one thing that we often do for people that are visually impaired is when we're doing mapping activities, we don't just do that by drawing. We do it physically, where we take a big piece of craft, like brown butcher paper kind of thing, and we will use tactile things like foam, foam stickies, and we will use puffy paint, like paint that dries, that it has like a surface to it. So you can actually write words out with puffy paint if you wanted to, so that somebody could feel that in a tactile way. So we typically do mapping activities like that. For someone with low vision, they might actually want to participate in the activity, but they need a bit more time to read the background information. So we want to give people maybe those materials in advance, right? Just as an example, that might be a barrier to participation, because everything that's happening real time requires them to know all of this stuff already, and everybody else might be able to read it more quickly. When we discuss things, right, as groups, we often do these group things where everybody is talking. Y'all were pretty good today in terms of like the noise level. Sometimes when I do this workshop in a small room with like 30 people, the volume gets really loud, and some people, it's like they'll just go outside and they'll work around the corner, and they need to be able to do that because they can't filter the noise from all of the other buzz that's going on. So, part of this is understanding and setting up an environment where everybody feels included and is able to participate in the design process. We were doing a workshop at an accessibility conference. And we thought, we knew that some people wouldn't be able to use the whiteboard, because we knew that there's about 5 or 6 people in the class that were in wheelchairs, like motorized wheelchairs or on scooters. Like, okay, they're not going to be able to work on the whiteboard. So how are we going to set this up? And one of the first things we thought of was that big craft butcher paper that we would put down on the desk. We're like, cool, we can do that. And then we kind of played this out in our head, and we're like, so here's what that room is going to look like. Everybody's going to be up at the whiteboard, and all the people that are on mobility devices are going to be gathered around one table, completely singled out from everybody else. And it was at that point that we're like, no, we're going to have everybody do it on tables. And that way, everybody gets to participate. We're all going to do the same thing at the same time, because that's what inclusion is, right? There's like the technical pieces of inclusion, but there is a huge emotional piece to inclusion as well. And so we go through this process and figure out, how does this stuff actually go wrong for us, right? And try to predict and go down this road by looking at these extremes. How would we do, and I'm literally saying this, how would we design this workshop if we knew that everybody in the class was in a wheelchair or on a motorized scooter? That's the extreme, right? So we're putting those extremes, just like we put the straw test and the equator test and the meridian test, and we put all of that onto the product. We need to do the same thing, put those extremes on our process itself. What would we do if we had a team of designers that were all deaf? We would never have phone calls. We would probably do almost everything in Slack or in person with interpreters or whatever it is, right? But we would have that real-time interaction that might happen in Slack. That might not be great for everybody, right? So we would really need to consider these things. And I leave this for you as an example. It's not like the answer. It's really just, here's some things to think about, and you can come up with a lot more as well. So one action that I would love for you to take, we've learned a little bit about product and a little bit about process here. I think you can probably see how this workshop could easily take up a full or even 2 days. One of the most important actions, I think, for you is to continue to take this forward as you are moving through your work. So ask this question, based on the last project, how can we improve our process to be more inclusive? If you ask this, my expectation of you is not perfection, right? My expectation of you is that you're always looking to get better. So can we make improvements from iteration to iteration of how we do the work? That's what I would ask you to really be aiming for. A lot of the accessibility community, or not just the community, but the industry, expects perfection and will tear a strip off you if something is wrong. But I'd encourage you to not be too discouraged by that. You're charged with making things better, not with making things perfect. Because the reality is, there is no such thing as perfect. We already know that, right? There's no such thing as perfect. So better is a much better word. I was trying to figure out how to say that without saying better. So some inclusion goals for you to think of as well. And I hope that I have embodied this here with you today. And if I have not, there are things that I would absolutely love for you to share with me, because I'm always looking to get better as well. So these are some really important inclusion goals. Participation. You should have the ability and opportunity to participate in solutions that will use and that will impact your life, right? Value. Your participation in a process is valued rather than tolerated or accommodated. I have to be really honest. I don't know how many of you here are in higher ed, but my least favorite word in the world is accommodation. Because accommodation is basically saying, we're not going to make this thing accessible for everybody. Like, not going to, and there's lots of different reasons for that, right? But here's this other thing we'll do for you instead. It is 100%, it creates this feeling that I'm not valued, right? And so my goal with this is, that people feel valued, and my participation is seen as valuable and not just a thing that we're doing because we have to, right? Because the law says I have to. And then the final one is kind of this idea of belonging or othering. Your participation should be predicated. This goes to that butcher paper thing that I was talking about, right? Your participation should be predicated on using the same tools at the same time in the same space, using the same process as anyone to the greatest extent possible. Right? We want people to feel included, and that emotional aspect of it is just as important as the technical, was the opportunity there, right? We want people to feel that they're included and that they're not getting some special treatment or different treatment. I've worked with many people with disabilities, and almost every single time when we talk about difficult subjects, it comes down to I don't want you to do something for special to me. I want you to treat me just like everybody else, right? That means good, treat people well, right? Not treat everybody badly, right? We want to treat everybody well. I would also ask you to move forward with this as well. Ask how you can measure inclusion. This is a really important topic. I work with a lot of organizations on some of this stuff. And I would say, for example, for a lot of our clients that are doing web and digital things that they're creating, how do we measure inclusion? And they talk about things like, the number of usability tests that we do with people with disabilities. I'm like, cool, what else? All right, and then like let's drill down into that. And so what we always find is like, cool, we're doing a lot of usability testing at the end of a process. What about like how many times through a project or through, let's say we do 10 projects a year. We do usability testing on all of them at the end, right? Cool, but how many people with disabilities did we talk about at the design phase before we've created the thing? Right? When we are in a position where we only get people with disabilities to evaluate the thing that we have decided on at the end, the thing that we have created, we are holding all the power in that relationship. So the power comes from involving people with disabilities at the beginning so that we're not just saying, we want you to evaluate how well we did with the decisions that we made on your behalf. How do you think we should solve this problem, right? You as a person with a disability, what would be most valuable to you here? We end up with much, much better solutions that way. So we measure inclusion not just like by sheer number of usability tests that we run, but how many usability tests do we do with people with different disabilities, right? How many people did we talk to up front? For this project, we talked with 10. For the next project, it was 100, right? So I would ask you to keep asking that moving forward. We don't really have time for questions, but we've had lots of great stuff going on. If you do have questions, please connect with me. I'll leave these things with you as well, food for thought. What things did you learn today? What are you going to do differently? And what things will you go forward and teach others? I would be incredibly honored if you wanted to connect and talk. This is me, this is what I do. I would love to share more with you, and please feel free to get in touch any way you like. Thank you very much.